Hi, this is Greg Smythe, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by GlobalNL. On this week's episode, we've got Colin Powell. Colin's originally from St. John's, Newfoundland, but is currently living and working in Toronto for Ernst & Young. Colin's managed to build a career in sustainable energy and climate change, starting by studying and doing a PhD at the University of Toronto. For those interested in building a career in climate change or sustainability, Colin provides some great and practical advice about how to get started. So if this is something you're interested in, I think you'll really enjoy this episode. Colin and I have a great conversation about both global and local approaches to climate change and sustainability, and talk specifically about Newfoundland's approach to this problem. I really enjoyed this conversation with Colin. I hope and I think you will as well. Happy listening, and we look forward to your feedback. I'll let Colin just do like a brief introduction, maybe just where you are now, and maybe we can even just start on what first compelled you to move to Toronto, but maybe you can do a brief intro and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. Thanks, GlobalNL. So I moved to Toronto, I guess, 16 years ago. I always forget. And so I'm almost hitting on the half of my life in Toronto versus half of my life. So I guess
the time goes quick. Time goes quick.
I know.
You don't really realize because we moved from Newfoundland 7 years ago or something like that. But I always think it's like 2 or 3 years ago. It's crazy.
I know. Yeah. And to imagine 17 years of my life have been up here versus Newfoundland is a totally different world. So how I got here briefly, university obviously pulled me up to Toronto. There were, a lot of different options available to me. And Min at the time didn't have a chemical engineering program. They had a oil and gas engineering program. So I really wanted to focus on that for I guess many reasons. I'm not really sure why. I guess chemistry teachers as a kid kind of push you in a direction that I was keen on. So I had different options. Waterloo, Toronto, and Montreal were the top ones for me that were not Min, and I chose Toronto mostly because I had family here actually. So I have family in Mississauga, which is a suburb of Toronto, and that was an easy choice for me. I think I was a little afraid of Montreal because of French, and then Waterloo was basically just moving to St. John's again, just another small town.
You hear a lot about, maybe in Silicon Valley there's a lot of Waterloo, I think because of BlackBerry and stuff. There's a huge population of Waterloo grads here. It does seem like it has a good engineering program anyways.
Definitely. I think that was the main draw for them. And 17 years ago, that Waterloo was what it was. And then now I think, Google has moved there. There's a ton of the big tech companies have fairly large offices there. Google just announced they're building a huge new office there on top of the one they already have. So, it's massive. It's growing. The city itself is an interesting place. I've only been a couple times. They just built themselves like a new transit system. They're now connected to Toronto's GO transit system, their commuter rail. So, things are growing. But for me at the time, I was just like, I don't really want to move to a similar small city. So that was kind of the high level draw for me to go to Toronto. Where I am right now, I'm at Ernst & Young. I'm working in their climate change and sustainability services practice, which is really focused on kind of advisory and what we call assurance, so an audit function for climate change and general sustainability issues. So we do greenhouse gas emission audits. We do audits for kind of any environmental or social metric that you can come up with. We're kind of open-minded as long as there's a way for us to audit it. And then on the advisor side, kind of anything goes. My focus is quite strict to climate change, even though whenever resources are required, I'll go on other projects, but typically focus on, say, carbon tax advisory, climate risk assessment, climate risk disclosures, anything around greenhouse gas emissions, like a life cycle assessment for a product, say, for iron ore, which if I make steel, which iron ore constituent is better than another one in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So that kind of stuff, where we're helping clients kind of present the case to maybe investors or government who's better on climate change than
Yeah.
other products.
I'm almost curious. I don't know if we need to get into this now, but I'm almost curious to know if like the SEC or some of the big like financial institutions are going to start requiring like more standardized greenhouse gas accounting practices. I imagine that's part of what you guys are doing, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a massive conversation. I can talk about it for hours. The greenhouse gas emissions part is mandatory on a number of levels. So it's usually state regulated in the US and it's provincially regulated in Canada. And it's not necessarily SEC. It's not bound by if you're a public company. It's bound by the actual emissions that you do produce annually. So the different states have different regulations. If you meet a minimum threshold of emissions, you do have to actually publicly report, and then you do have to get them verified by an auditing company. So the big four, all of us have contracts, various companies to do that annually for them, and the actual report that we do goes to the government. It doesn't really go to the company itself. So we're actually reporting to the government on behalf of them that yes, that number is correct. And so we do that in Canada too. It's actually just one tiny part of the disclosures that are now kind of coming out around climate risk. And so the public company side is investors are pushing public companies and issuers to say, can you talk a little bit more about how you're preparing for climate change? So greenhouse gas emissions is one tiny part of it. And then there's other things like governance, strategies. Are you proposing to get to net zero carbon within the next 20 years? And how is that going to impact kind of your annual reporting, your annual financial reporting? And so there's a push a little bit to get that kind of integrated, anything around climate risk, into the financial reporting themselves. And that was actually pushed by Mark Carney, who's the former Bank of Canada governor, I believe is what he was, and Bank of England. So him and Bloomberg actually pushed these kind of recommendations around disclosing on climate risk, and greenhouse gas emissions is like a tiny part of that.
Okay. All right. I do want to talk more about this, but maybe when we go back to I had why engineering in my list of questions. Maybe you alluded to that, to I often think back to why you make career decisions on my own. And normally it's like a sibling did the similar one, or I had a lot of engineers in my family and I was good at math and science, and it kind of just led me that way. But I'm curious to know, because then you went through all three levels. You did your undergrad, master's, and doctorate, or PhD. And it seems like you came more and more focused on climate change as you went through. So I'm just curious to know, maybe what brought you to engineering, and then even from undergrad, you were involved in Solar Toronto, Solar Decathlon, Renewable Energy Fair, and stuff like that. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of push it back to my high school chemistry teachers. I don't know, you probably know them, Fons Whiffen and Ken Coffey. Ken Coffey actually passed away, I think, very recently. Right? Yeah.
I had Fons Whiffen, who was really good. I never had Ken, but I heard wonderful things about him.
He was fantastic. I mean, I remember the first, grade 10 being in his class in Gonzaga, and the first hour of class was him scaring the shit out of us about this chemical that we didn't know about, which was dihydrogen oxide, that killed millions and millions of people every year. And, people choke on it, people die from lack of it. Just a terrifying story. And then, he writes on the board that it's H2O, and you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. It's a great teacher trick to scare the shit out of people. And not that that was definitely, obviously I remember that now, 20 years later, but he and Fons Whiffen were definitely pushing for me to be kind of more on the applied side of that science. I think they did see something that I was interested in it. I was good in it. I knew how to do math. All the AP offerings that we had at Gonzaga also helped push me along, and also prep for, university that wasn't Memorial, where sometimes calculus was required, or higher level chemistry or physics was required. And so I obviously, took their advice and went with that. In terms of engineering in my family, I think my grandfather was an engineer. He went to MIT to do his master's in I think it really focused on the sewer system in St. John's. It was a very, very interesting thesis that I actually read when I went to Boston once, and my mom was like, "You should go to MIT and find his thesis," and I did. And he was kind of, it mapped out the initial progress for St. John's as a city in terms of where and how to put sewer pipes, and kind of building up the wastewater treatment system, which kind of only came into fruition in a in a large way a couple of years ago when they finally built the wastewater treatment plant next to in the harbor. Yeah. So that kind of, led me down the path of chemical engineering. I, went to U of T, did my degree there. I did work terms kind of back and forth, either in Toronto or St. John's, one of which was at Valet Inco, I think it was called at the time, at the demonstration plant for the Voisey's Bay smelter. So I think, Voisey's Bay was just not actually producing yet, and this was the demo plant in Long Harbor. So they had to prove to the government that if they were going to smelt there, that it would actually work. So I worked, a work term on that. So definitely got into process engineering. Anything chemistry was critical to kind of pushing me where I am today. And then right after, I think, in terms of solar stuff, is when I got into Solar Toronto. So we kind of formed a group to prepare a bid for this competition in the US called the Solar Decathlon, which actually I'm not sure if it still exists, but because the technology has advanced a lot and kind of the mindset of a lot of builders has transformed a lot. But essentially it was, build a home that can be fully powered on solar energy. And so there were teams from all over the US, all over Canada, all over the globe. And, basically you just had to prepare a bid to finance it, construct it, timelines, and you had to essentially construct it wherever you were and then transport it to Washington, D.C., where you would kind of showcase the home. People would come and see it, and then be judged on, various aspects, technically, what it looked like, how it could be financed, how it could be scaled, things like that. Definitely an amazing process. We didn't actually go through with it because we couldn't get financing to do it. We couldn't actually get funded to build the home itself, but we, got to the point where we had a bid package in hand. So the U of T kind of liaison for that was a professor looking to do. He had funding for a master's degree to do the financing of a particular solar technology, and so his focus was chemical engineering for this particular novel solar cell, which was basically a inkjet printer of solar PV, where you could just print this wherever you were. You could change the combination of the particular pigments on it, so that could draw different parts of the light spectrum and change the efficiency of it. So you can, bring it to Toronto, you could bring it to St. John's and make a different cell that would really be tuned to the particular geography, the latitude of where you would be. So it would actually be more efficient. And so he said, hey, here's a master's degree, make it, do you want to do it? It's all about the financing and kind of the economics of this particular technology, which definitely put me down that path. And then I veered, I finished that. It was 2008, recession, wasn't getting a job after it. And then my other professor in that, because I was co-supervised, said, hey, I also have a fully funded PhD. It's in a totally different topic. It's on wastewater treatment, but the math is the exact same of what you were doing in your master's. So for my master's, a lot of like stochastic calculus, electricity models, where we're kind of just building that economic function. And the wastewater treatment was computational fluid dynamics, but the stochastic nature of the behavior was the exact same. So I didn't really need to learn anything else beyond the actual technology that I was, modeling itself. So then I did that.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm almost curious to know, because like in 2000, it's interesting to hear like the climate change dialogue, like change, like because I graduated from school in 2007 and it wasn't really that prevalent, then. and the dialogue globally seems to have shifted quite a bit. But I'm curious. I wonder how you thought about finding a job, like probably even looking through your connections on LinkedIn and stuff. There's so many job titles like in like either climate change or sustainability has become a profession, that I didn't
Yeah.
really even think about, I think, until we met actually. And then now there's probably all kinds of, like you're saying, greenhouse gases is just a part of that. But how do you feel like when you're going through school, you're like, what kind of job am I going to find doing this? Or did you, or did you just have, I don't know,
I
I
mean,
guess, what are
it's
your
tough
thoughts on that?
because at 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 the time, I think there was definitely no, sustainability managers or director of sustainability or chief sustainability officers at organizations, and now you're seeing that like everywhere. It's almost a required function in the Fortune 500 companies. So at you know even today, there's no direct education function to be a sustainability officer. There's no like sustainable engineering degree. It's environmental engineering maybe, but that's not typically focused on sustainability. That's focused on wastewater or um, mine tailings or things like that. It's not really the strong function of greenhouse gas emissions or anything related to climate change. So even today, you're struggling to kind of build up that capacity in the education system to deliver that supply of a sustainability manager or sustainability function in organizations. So it's tough. I mean, you see it even today. Like you could look on LinkedIn and see and search greenhouse gas emissions, and that's where you're going to find kind of jobs in that space. But 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't have found that much.
No. I'm curious, like, what I actually wrote a question down, like, what advice would you have for someone who's like going into engineering school now that wants to work in sustainable energy, or just like some path, like if there's not a clear path, like what would you recommend to someone that's starting out now at a high school?
Yeah, I actually had a friend come to me quite recently, and he had done his engineering degree and worked at a marketing firm actually in like analytics, and was like, I hate this. How do I get into sustainability? Like, I know what you do. It sounds really interesting. Um, and I've spoken at a number of different kind of, younger, like third or fourth year engineering in front of their classes, and the big question is like, how do you get to where you are? And mine was really a combination of things like connections and existing connections and networking to build new connections. And then what I always tell people who are coming to say, hey, can I work at EY? I always tell them to kind of be aware of what's happening around them. Whether it's, we live in Toronto, so is it Toronto politics, Ontario politics, Canada politics? Are you aware of the climate issues that will actually be forced upon us by a government? Not forced, but will be kind of broad policy as something we'll have to use as a guide for anything we do. So can you talk about those quite easily to clients or to us or as your colleagues? So that's what I kind of tell people, like, if you're trying to get into the field, go and meet people, meet as many people as you can, be good about it, be nice, don't be too pushy, ask for a coffee, pay for that coffee, make sure you're abiding by their time constraints, have like lists of questions for them, be very focused in the information you're trying to get out of them, and then use your existing connections. So, my friend just said, hey, I know you work in sustainability. Can I please take you for a drink? I just want to learn a little bit more. I have a few questions for you. So it's a very easy way to just say, I have I have an ask. Can I take some of your time to really just learn more? And then the thing that he did, after we had that drink, he followed up and said, hey, thank you for your time. Here's what I'm going to do. Here is an outcome that I'm hoping for, and I'll get back to you when maybe I might need some more help. So it was very actually quite focused, and I do like to see that, because even, I'm not a partner at EY, I'm not a high level person, but you do like to see that kind of the care taken with my time, and I'm sure you're probably the exact same way. Like, people are asking you, how do I work where you work? How do I get there? How do I get to where you are?
I do get a lot of like very open-ended questions, like how do I work in tech, or how do I work in Silicon Valley? And I'm
Yeah.
like, man, that's a very broad question.
Yeah.
And I do think at the very base, though, I think you said early on, is that the nature of the work is not that different, and having a base in some sort of engineering or business background, like the likelihood is that you can probably work for a company that's working on sustainable energy or
Yeah.
transport, or or whatever it might be. But it does take time to understand what the job opportunities look like. For me, I remember even just translating my skills, because I went from, let's say,
Mhm.
an unsustainable career to one in sustainability, and a lot of those skills were very applicable, but um, it took time to translate those skills, and you had to sit down and go through, whether it's managing a supplier or project management skills, all these things. It takes time to sit down and go through what that looks like. But it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a key skill too of translating your supply of of skills to what the actual employer needs. And I think that was an ask of my friend as well. He's been in marketing and analytics for the last 10 years, but he wants to actually do engineering now. And so I'm like, so how do you tune each part of that now in your resume to what the actual employer wants? Everything is engineering, but how do you use the language of the employer to tell them that you can do what they want? And I think that's also a key skill of in anything, not just trying to get a job, but also any of your client work, is kind of taking what you can do and translating it into a way that you want. um, and it ties to a bit of adapting to your surroundings, which I think is a big thing that engineers kind of do well. Is that we have a process mind, and we can think of an issue and find a pathway to get to that solution. I think that's a huge benefit in our field in sustainability, but anything that is engineering applicable. Of That's why we have been focusing a little bit on engineers in our hiring for some reason, where they have the background to be able to apply just like solutions problem sets to any kind of issue that's thrown at them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think when I did engineering, I think it just taught me how to solve problems in some
Yeah.
way, just to use some, the scientific method or some basic problem solving skill set. And then you can just, I don't know if I say you can solve any problem, but you can sort of break almost any problem down into some
Yeah.
constituents, and you figure it out step by step, and I do think there's some basic physics, chemistry, math, science that apply to almost anything that's
Yeah.
physical or things like that.
Yeah.
Um, I do, maybe just going back to the general dialogue on climate change. I mean, I do try and follow it as closely as I can, and it's always interesting to see how the different countries are handling it, and obviously, I'm sure provincially, and maybe you can even help educate me a little bit. Like I looked up yesterday, I think Canada has a federal carbon tax now, if I understand it right,
Yep.
that I think is currently like $20 a ton and increasing. I didn't see a specific date. At some point, it's going up to like $50 a ton. And then
Yep.
I think BC has a carbon tax, but I don't know if other provinces do or not. But I'm just curious to know what the high level context is there, because I'm sure the variability across countries has got to be even more with respect to how people are doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, globally, most of the most countries don't have some sort of carbon tax or carbon pricing system. A lot do, and they kind of take on various forms. In Canada specifically, yes, we have a federal carbon tax, but it actually only applies in a couple provinces, which didn't meet the federal government's requirements for some sort of carbon pricing regime. In Ontario, previously, they had a cap and trade system, which is a way to kind of force companies to actually reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by allowing them the sale or trade of credits. But that was scrapped by the government, and so then the federal government applied this carbon tax in the province of Ontario. Quebec, for example, has a cap and trade system, and so it doesn't have a federally applied carbon tax. So it was kind of the federal government's way of saying, all right, we're still going to allow you the flexibility to regulate greenhouse gas emissions the way you want. However, there are minimum requirements you will have to meet, which is a price on carbon that escalates every year. And so the federal government's price is $50 per ton by 2022. So this year it went up to $30 per ton. And I actually didn't really hear much about it. So January 1st, it moved from $20 to $30 a ton. And I did not see any news at all on that change. It was regulated that, it was going to happen anyway. But when you did see the first application of the carbon tax, kind of, the news went crazy and said, we're all going to be poor and everyone's, all hell will break loose. That did not happen.
Because when I looked at the BC website yesterday, they had said they've had a carbon tax, I think, for like 15 years or something like that. And
yeah.
Did I lose you? Or maybe your video just delayed. Okay. Yeah. And they had said they had like 10 or 15% GDP growth in that period of time.
Yeah, I mean they're hailed as a success story, I think, globally as one of the earliest jurisdictions that has applied a carbon tax. They had it, they built it in a certain way that was supposed to be cost neutral. So any of
revenue. I always get confused by that, like revenue neutral. I don't know if I guess it creates the incentive to reduce carbon, but you're not actually paying net money out, right? You get it back in some kind of credit or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And so federally, say in the province of Ontario, we'll actually, most people will actually get more money back than they will pay out in terms of the carbon tax that is on fuel or gasoline for cars. So most people will come out ahead. If you're quite rich, you probably won't come out ahead, but it won't be by that much. So you probably won't even notice it. And actually, the carbon pricing regime is only one tiny part of Canada's federal climate change strategy, right? Like they have both a kind of a regulation side and a pricing side, and the carbon price is only aimed to reduce greenhouse gas, only aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Like I think it's only 10 to 20% of the actual reductions that we'll have to do to meet our Paris targets will be accomplished by the pricing regime. The rest of it is quite regulatory. Like they've put federal regulations around coal as electricity. So, I don't know them exactly offhand, but by 2030, I think you're not really allowed to build new coal plants, and any ones that you are going to build have to be, strictly controlled in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So doing carbon capture and things like that. And, the federal government can do that. That's their jurisdiction. So that's going to happen. And that will probably do a lot more than actually pricing, the natural gas that we use to heat our homes and the gasoline that we use to drive our cars. But it's all kind of part of a big package. Newfoundland is actually an interesting part of that, where, they technically have a carbon pricing regime. So the federal government said, yes, okay, we'll accept yours, and we won't force you to accept the federal government's pricing regime. But what they did, which is very interesting, is most provinces have an existing fuel tax, and so they charge you excise taxes on fuel, and they put that towards whatever the hell they want to put it towards. They can just put it towards general funding for anything if they want, and that's what Newfoundland was doing anyway. And so the province of Newfoundland said, well, how about we just, change the name of this excise tax to the carbon tax, and we won't change it. We'll just keep the amount the same, and then that will accomplish what you wanted us to do to the federal government. And the federal government said, sure, we don't really care, because the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that Newfoundland is actually producing and that will be impacted by this tax is tiny. And so they did the exact same thing for PEI as well, where they just said, you know what, you're not going to really make that much of an impact. So taking your existing tax and just renaming it, calling it a carbon tax, is okay with us. So they basically let them off, and it remains to be seen what will happen now as the federal price escalates, because the province of Newfoundland and PEI have not said they're going to escalate it as well. But so there'll be some questions around, are you now meeting the letter of the law? Are you actually meeting what we asked you to do. But essentially, the federal government let those tiny provinces, like PEI and Newfoundland, in terms of emissions, off with kind of the status quo. So Newfoundland is a contributor. It only has like one large emitter for Canada. Large emitter is defined by 50,000 tons of carbon or more, and that large emitter is the Come By Chance refinery. And the Holyrood generating station was actually in there as well at some point, but it hasn't been used a ton. And now Muskrat Falls is supposed to take that the Holyrood
completely offline, right?
Yeah. They're using bunker fuel oil in there, and so it's an insane process that would never be built today. They would never do that. It's actually terrible because they have to ship in the bunker oil. It's terribly polluting, but it will be taken offline once Muskrat Falls gets built.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's. I know Muskrat Falls has been controversial, and I don't know the economics of it that well, but I mean, it's pretty incredible that the province will be effectively run on sustainable energy forever. I know that the cost of that maybe is lopsided and controversial, I'm sure, but it's pretty incredible to have like that theoretically like infinite resource forever. I feel like at some point we'll likely find a consumer for excess power. It seems like excess renewable energy in Eastern Canada will be a valuable commodity at some point. Maybe getting it to market is a challenge, but even with the transmission line, it feels like it has access to market. So at some point, I feel like it'll find a consumer.
Yeah, I mean, since it's built, it's going to have to be paid for. So you might as well just deal with the consequences at this point. As much as we can look back and say, "Crap, we maybe shouldn't have done that." It's now at the point of no return, and so let's find a market for it. I think the key things they've done is definitely the Newfoundland and Nova Scotia transmission link was critical, is critical, and that was basically on budget, and now it's just an economic conversation of does Ontario want to pay for that power? How do we get it to Ontario? Does Maine and New England do they want to pay for it? And how much does it cost versus kind of what they're currently paying? Most of the American states in that area have renewable mandates, so they have to have a certain amount of renewable energy in their portfolio by certain times. And the big question will be: is Muskrat Falls hydropower considered renewable energy?
Why would it not be?
Yeah, because so there are greenhouse gas emissions from hydropower, because when you flood large areas of land, methane gets released from the ground, and because it's soaked in water, it gets released, and then it gets released to the atmosphere. And methane is quite a potent greenhouse gas. It's 25 times the impact of as carbon dioxide. So there are greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. It's not zero. So some jurisdictions say hydropower isn't considered like a renewable, a green energy source. It really is up to them. They can, there's no standard to say, X or Y. So it'll be a question of kind of Newfoundland proving that, this is still actually quite a low carbon energy source, electricity source. Yeah. So take it, and it's probably cheaper than you'll actually find when you're trying to build new wind power or new solar power in your own jurisdictions.
I can imagine in some of those regions too that like the cheap natural gas has got to be a tough competitor too.
Yeah.
And has put weight on trying to compete with that market.
Well, that was the issue I think with Muskrat Falls, is where they weren't considering different scenarios for natural gas pricing, and so when they went through the feasibility studies, one of the big downfalls I think was that they weren't considering the fact that the U.S. was going to have a sudden windfall in natural gas supply, so would dropping the price significantly and requiring them not to need hydroelectricity sources. So most of them now are building natural gas plants like crazy because natural gas is so cheap. But again, like that's a bit of a risky proposition, because they are still burning natural gas creates fossil fuels. It is not a clean source of energy as much as people might want to say it is. It's obviously better than coal. It's better than burning bunker fuel oil in Holyrood. But it's still contributing to climate change. It's contributing to a company's climate risk. It's contributing to a government's climate risk. And as we have to transition away from fossil fuels, building as many natural gas plants as they are, that they're going to be a problem. Those are going to be kind of stranded assets as we go forward. So it's a decision that I think will help Newfoundland. The positive benefits will be kind of further out in the future than tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part. And I think when you have a province that's so strapped for cash, it's really tough when you make such a large investment, and the payback is probably over such a long period of time. I hope we just don't give it away at some point, there's some risk that they just kind of give it away and pay down some of the debt to deal with it. But because I do think it'll pay back
it's all
at some point.
Economic decision. And so how much will the federal government help? Sorry, I think you delayed there.
Yeah. No, I think I understand what you're saying. I was going to shift gears a little bit, but anything else on climate change or sustainability? Anything else you want to touch on before I ask you maybe some more general GlobalNL questions?
I think the climate change in Newfoundland piece is a very interesting one. A lot of the modeling has shown that Newfoundland will most likely positively benefit from climate change. It will have longer growing seasons. It will be able to grow different crops. It may actually see fewer storms because when the ice caps in Greenland will melt, when the ice caps in Greenland melt, it will push the Gulf Stream further away from Newfoundland. That is certain projections have said that, and pushing the Gulf Stream away from Newfoundland pushes the storm path away from Newfoundland. So storms like 75 to 100 centimeter drops of snow might not actually happen in St. John's that much as climate change progresses. They'll be actually happening more out to sea. So it'll be an interesting kind of time. I think in the next 50 to 100 years, we won't be alive, but Newfoundland may actually come out quite well in terms of climate change.
Yeah, maybe there's some. I was going to ask this question. This is more around perverse effects of making say sustainability changes. Like the one example, I listened to this podcast one time and they talked about energy efficiency in homes. I think in the 80s or 90s, they put a big, I can't remember the name of the mandate, but to increase the efficiencies of appliances and insulation, all these things. But I think the energy consumption went up in direct correlation, or it went up 10 times in that time. So people are still spending around the same amount of money on energy consumption, or everything got much more efficient, but people just use way more energy. I'm just curious, is that a common thing where you kind of think you're well, we'll make all these homes efficient, we'll stop wasting all this heat, but then people just crank up the air conditioning in that case? I'm sure it's got to be a factor, or testing things, whether it actually is going to have the benefit you think it's going to have.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I'm trying to rack my brain. There's actually a name on the effect. I think it's maybe called the Boomerang effect, where you're doing so much to help yourself. It's quite general. It doesn't necessarily apply to energy efficiency, but you're building capacity to help yourself, and then you end up just kind of using way more in the end. I mean, it's a terrible way, so we don't have to include that, but terrible way to explain it. But what happened was, appliances were getting more energy efficient, but then homes were getting quite larger. And so you see the average home size from 1960, 1970 to now they're almost doubled. And so while the individual appliances were getting more efficient, we required more energy to actually heat that home. And so the average energy use of a person increased dramatically because we were allowing homes to be built quite that much larger. And then, there were so many other factors where urban sprawl has kind of pushed homes further and further away from where people live. And so while cars were getting more efficient, we had to drive more to be able to get between our house and our job. And so all those things contributed to kind of an overall increase in greenhouse gas emissions from kind of personal use of things, even though those individual things were getting better at using fossil fuels. So I think it's definitely something we have to consider. I mean, greenhouse gas emission policy is not quite the simple thing. It's not all about reducing. It's kind of where you have to reduce. What is the biggest impact? What does that thing cost? How does that impact people? And there are also co-benefits of it where, if you make a home more energy efficient, it often leads to better air quality in a house. And so there are social benefits as well. And also in offices. So if you build an energy efficient office, you're actually generally making the air quality better. And people work better in those offices. So, there's one of the benefits touted for green buildings is it actually makes it a better place to work. Like you and I will actually want to be there. We'll actually want to talk to our coworkers. We'll actually want to sit at our desk. We'll be able to focus more because there's less carbon dioxide in the air, because it's filtered better. And so there's a lot of interesting kind of co-benefits that are attached to climate policy as well.
Okay, interesting. No, I appreciate the perspective. I think it's just interesting, and I think I talk to a lot of young engineers just through different things I'm working on through GlobalNL, and it is interesting to hear a lot of young folks in Newfoundland how engaged they are and interested in climate change or sustainability or kind of different things. So it's a good conversation. I think a lot of people will be interested to listen to this. I think the next question I was going to ask you more, just a couple of things on GlobalNL in general. I think you had originally got involved, I think, as a program coordinator when you came to starting to help as a volunteer for GlobalNL. I'm curious to know why, and you've been supporting, I guess I should tell that kind of audience that you've been supporting in that role or different organizing events in Toronto for at least a year, maybe more, probably maybe a year and a half. And I'm just curious to know why, what compelled you, or what was the reason you originally got involved?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it does stem a lot from, people's desire to kind of stay within their own group almost. When you move to different places, as you left Newfoundland, you still have that affinity or that draw for people from where that are from where you are from. You do seek out the Newfoundlanders, I think, wherever you go, and no matter what, you have that. They have that draw, you have that draw, and you don't want to ever lose that. And that, I feel like that's quite broad. That's probably not just Newfoundlanders. That's probably anyone from any different particular place or ethnicity or culture. But I think in terms of Newfoundland, we always kind of like to find the people who are from Newfoundland. We always like to kind of keep in touch with them, no matter where we are. And it's also a good way to network. I think it's always a key kind of, common trait that it's something to talk about. It's, if you're meeting someone new, it's, you can have that discussion point around Newfoundland. If you're meeting someone for a job interview, it's always a kind of like a key thing to bring up, because someone's like, oh, I love Newfoundland, I went there 2 years ago. And then, you use that as a trail to kind of get away from the job interview, and you use it as just a discussion piece. So, I mean,
I don't know if you noticed, I started wearing this pin periodically to work and things like that. And it's a great conversation starter because no one knows what the flag is.
Yeah.
But then most people don't even know where it is, but then you can kind of help educate people where it is and what it's about. So it's always a good thing. Now,
yeah, I think in your case, like being in the Bay Area is a bit more removed. I think like me being in Toronto, people hopefully know that Newfoundland flag. And I mean, I probably veered from the question a little bit, like why I got involved in GlobalNL. I think it was just still kind of a desire to keep connection with the province. I'm back. I'm back in Newfoundland probably 3 to 4 times a year. My parents live there. My sister lives there. My 2 nephews live there. So I'm still connected, physically when I go back. But I think in between then, it's still a desire to have that connection. I mean, you're in San Francisco. A lot of the GlobalNL team is, all over the place, Newfoundland, Toronto, elsewhere. And so still having that kind of connection back allows us to keep our roots a bit. But then it's also, as I said, kind of a conversation piece. So whether I'm doing client networking or networking for other things I do, it's always kind of a place to kind of start for conversations. and always a place that leads somewhere to just more and more conversation. So, and I mean, it's always like, I love Newfoundland, so that's kind of the place for me. I think that's, it'll always have that place in my heart, as emotional as that seems. But it's also a way for me to kind of, grow my career and grow my friend circle, and
I think I value it. I think like this sounds like a little bit not selfish, but I feel like the more I give to GlobalNL, the more I get, in a way. And it's like the podcast is an example of that, where I've got to meet, like, because I was, I'm kind of maybe the face of it, and me and Kingsley are kind of the front face of it. So we get people reaching out all the time to say different things. So I have these phone calls, maybe once a week, or certainly like 4 or 5 a month, of like other, just a student from the university, but also other people from like the business community that want to talk about what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually why I started the podcast. That I was getting to talk to all kinds of interesting people, but kind of in private. And I was like, I really should have some of these conversations in public, because there's just so many people. I mean, there's kind of a subset of like kind of famous Newfoundlanders that everybody knows, but there's this real community of people doing like what you're doing, that not that you're not famous, but doing some really interesting stuff that I think is that I think a young person from Newfoundland could learn something from, and I think getting to share that story is a really positive thing.
Yeah, I think we're also in quite a unique position sometimes, because often you have to leave the island to be able to get a job, or to understand generally quite what's out there. I left the island at 18, and ostensibly for an engineering degree, but also I am gay, and I left. That helped kind of bring out new worlds to me. It definitely showed me a different world. Not that being gay in Newfoundland is a terrible thing, but at the time, like, it certainly wasn't the best thing. And so coming to Toronto, you see many new things, and not to focus on that too much, but I think the fact that we do leave typically. And then we're starting, this GlobalNL piece, where it's more around helping people who are not necessarily in Newfoundland connect back with Newfoundland. That is quite a unique position for us as Newfoundlanders, because typically someone's going to leave at some point in their life from Newfoundland, potentially go back at some point, but always want to keep that connection. So I think this is a very good connection point for a lot of people, no matter if they plan to go back or not. Like, in my foreseeable future, I do not see me living in Newfoundland. Circumstances may change, but for the next 15 to 20 to 30 years, I don't see myself living there for various reasons. However, keeping that connection point beyond my own family, I think, is critical.
Yeah, I really feel the same way, I think. And that was the other thing. The more people I met through living in Houston and here that were from Newfoundland, like, they feel really close to there, even if they left 20 or 30 years ago. And most people want to give back, but they really don't know how. The university has done an okay job, but we're trying to work with them to create better engagement. And I'm even trying to encourage people to give money more. In the US, people give tons of money to their universities, and like at Min, it's not really a norm. There's been a lot of successful people in the universities in a tough financial position. And I think it's a wonderful thing that people should contribute to more and more over time.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, I almost feel more affinity for Memorial University than I do the University of Toronto. And I spent 12, 13, I don't even know, 17 years of my life at University of Toronto. And I'm probably closer to Min than I am to U of T. So that's maybe, I suppose.
I mean, I think, it probably, University of Toronto probably doesn't need your help as much, maybe that's probably part of it.
True.
And I think, I think back to your other point about, I mean, there's also, sometimes I get kind of questions around whether, say, GlobalNL could accelerate the brain drain in a way, encourage people to leave. And I really hope, like, that's not the intent, certainly, but I do think it's important to give young people like a window into the opportunities they should have access to. We shouldn't be limiting people's opportunities to keep them at home.
Yeah. And I mean, we don't have
And
the resources to educate everyone on everything either. And so that's not, it's not a feasible action. I think, like, look at Bethany Downer, like she couldn't have done what she did and is doing, like
right.
staying in at Memorial, like to be fully blunt, like that's just not possible. So I think, like, allowing that function and not really, I get the brain drain issue, but as long as we're creating jobs that can actually sustain the economy in Newfoundland and grow the economy, I think people will come back for whatever they need to.
Yeah.
And I mean, now you're seeing such a massive boom in the startup community and the tech community because there's still a good base of employees and skills there, and
Yeah.
so it makes sense to kind of grow a business there now.
I think too, like the other good example, I guess the way I like to think about GlobalNL is more as like a conduit and that can help people go either direction, right? So
Yeah.
if people are at home and they want to connect to, Newfoundland expats that are living abroad, they can do that. Or or if they're kind of moving to a new city, it can be like that kind of outward communication. Or it's like people like you and I that have lived away for a period of time and that are kind of contributing expertise or whatever it might be back to the province. I think that's a real benefit, but it should be a two-way street. And the other specific story I like to tell is that
Yeah.
the other brief story is that with like the Colab software company that I'm an advisor for, those were two young engineers that they both came to Silicon Valley and worked for tech companies. And when they got that experience, they actually came up with the idea between working on this like Hyperloop project and working at these companies. They were like, you know what, we should really start a company. But after that experience, in LA at the Hyperloop competition, and then here in Silicon Valley for their work experience, they decided to go back home and start a company.
Yeah.
And now also like I'm an advisor for them. There's a girl, Catherine Courage, who's an executive at Google that's from Newfoundland. That's an advisor for them. And to me that's and now they've raised $3 or $4 million and they're employing at least 20 people and hoping to maybe double that in the next couple of years. And so to me that's a wonderful example of how there's benefits in both directions, and them getting opportunities outside the province has been like a huge net benefit, and so I hope there's more opportunities like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, we have a built-in network, I think, and GlobalNL is just, as you said, the conduit to kind of facilitating those conversations, and that's how I hope it grows. And I think, we're having a conversation right now, but like Jeremy's having a conversation with Catherine, like those things are happening, and I think that's a big push for us, and that's part of our mission where we're facilitating those conversations. I know we've had a lot of discussions of what is our mission,
Yeah.
trying to drive that home, but those conversations where they're existing networks, they are there, or the connection is there, but we're just kind of pushing them closer and closer and trying to get results out of it.
The other small like story I'll tell is that like through our like Slack channel, I created this like it's called Founder Circle, and it's basically like 5 or 6 local startups in Newfoundland that are all in that channel. Like it's all the CEOs or founders of the companies, and they just ask each other questions about just the most basic things. But I guess like there's no other place for them to land to ask to be the funneling point for that. And so like that to me, like that's an invisible benefit that we're having, right? That we're not physically doing anything, but at least like it's some platform or landing point for those people to come and communicate.
And I mean, it's interesting because we don't, as much as we are like GlobalNL is an organization that is trying to facilitate those connections, we also are trying to be public and open about it and talk about it so that other people know what's happening. And so, I mean, that's an example of something we don't necessarily talk about, that we have this thing that we're facilitating conversations between startups that, that are really helping those groups. And they're talking to each other, getting tips. Like, we're really facilitating that. Not that we should be talking about it openly or need to, but I think like those things are kind of the unseen benefits of what you and Kingsley have kind of started. And
I think we should, though. I think this year, with a little bit more resources and folks engaged, I think we should start to tell those stories, and whether they're sometimes the big or small, sometimes the small ones are more important than the big ones. And I think we need to start to tell those, small stories or small connections sometimes can end up having a big impact. So
Yeah, no, it's true. I think, and it's a matter of, how do we get the resources to be able to start to tell those
Yeah.
those
Well, I
stories?
think, I don't know if you actually heard, I think we actually have two students now. So there's
Oh
a
wow,
MUSEP student that is on part-time. And then I think we've got a full-time engineering student that will be on board for at least the rest of the semester. So 3 or 4 months, but so that's pretty exciting. I mean, having folks that are fully dedicated and paid is a great starting point. And then I think later in the year, which we talked about last week, I think we'll look at maybe formalizing, like incorporating raising money and then hiring someone at least on a part-time basis later in the year or maybe next year. But I think it'll be exciting to get to that point.
yeah. I mean, outside the podcast, I guess we were at EY. We have this program where we are allowed to kind of like a nonprofit would basically come to EY and say, "Hey, I have this need for this service. Can you guys help out?" And we provide pro bono services for organizations in various functions. Like it kind of can be anything. Generally, we stray away from like niche services. Like we wouldn't go do a greenhouse gas emission audit for free, but we would help you with marketing, help you with high level strategy. And anything from a 3-month engagement to 1 hour a week, some help. So, but we have to be incorporated. So it's something to think about as we move forward.
Yeah, I think the good thing is, like, sometimes you're never sure how long these things are going to last, and I think we've been working on it 2 years, and I think it's ebb and flowed a bit, but I think the interest is there. Like every
Yeah.
time we put energy into it, like the response is there, whether it's the podcast or an event or whatever it is. And so, like, I think the feedback is there, and then the interest, like Kingsley and I and you and a few others have stayed consistently engaged for an extended period. So I think that to me signals enough to incorporate, to probably, because there's some benefits of raising money and becoming more
Mhm,
formal, but there's like kind of costs that come with it,
for
burdens,
sure.
taxes, responsibilities, those kind of things come
Yeah.
with it. But I think the benefits will outweigh the cost of it.
Yeah.
So anyways, I think that's all I got. Thanks for the time. That
Yeah.
was a really interesting conversation. I find the climate change discussion, I think, is interesting. Sometimes I worry it's like it seems like a cyclical conversation that sometimes it seems very prevalent and important in the media, but then seems to fade a little bit. But I think the
Mhm,
momentum seems to be real. I like that
yeah.
the dialogue seems to be permanently shifted, and you see folks like Jeff Bezos just this week, pledged $10 billion to that. And the other big one that I thought was really important recently was a guy, Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, I think,
Yeah.
wrote his letter to CEOs. And it was just like he's like the biggest money manager in the world,
Yeah.
and wrote this message to all his current CEOs and anyone else to say that if you're not managing climate risk, then you're not doing your job. And
Yeah.
like, to me, that was like a shot across the bow at all the biggest CEO or all the CEOs in the
Absolutely.
world, and because like until the money really changes direction, I feel like not like the government still can't do a lot, but when guys like him are sending that message, or Jeff Bezos, like I feel like that will actually move the needle, and
Eh,
it's exciting to see some of those things happen.
Yeah. I mean, and that letter was massive. I mean, the day after it came out, the phone calls that our group got globally from clients were insane. So you had just new clients come out of the woodwork. You had existing clients say, "Oh my God, what? Like, how do we respond to this? What do we do?" And you saw other money managers follow the same kind of similar paths, where they were, if you don't have a net zero carbon goal within the next 15 years, we're not going to give you any money. So like it's happening, I think, and the big thing now that's being pushed is this climate risk disclosure stuff, where you have to start thinking and discussing publicly how you're addressing climate change in your financial and your non-financial disclosures. That will be a massive push, and you're seeing in some countries where it's becoming mandatory. It's mandatory in France. It's becoming mandatory in the UK, and then there are potential EU kind of EU-wide things maybe coming down. It hasn't happened in Canada. It hasn't happened in the US. There is a bill at the House of Representatives now in the US to actually start to make this mandatory. It obviously won't get signed within a couple years, but it's definitely, that's kind of pushing things forward. I mean, the government can do as much as they can, but ultimately they're not necessarily responsible for greenhouse gas emissions and that are occurring in our jurisdiction. So they can mandate, reduce X by X, but it's up to the companies who have to respond to these challenges who are actually doing it. And it's fantastic to see people like Larry Fink being like, I'm not gonna invest in you unless you're actually making these decisions. And those are financial decisions he's making. I mean, they are literally, climate risk is a financial risk. And we talk about this constantly. The biggest challenge now is actually translating that. And so, if I'm an oil and gas company, if I'm trying to build a new tar sands in Alberta, what does that impact to me? How is like a transitioning climate changing the way I do economics for that actual facility? So, will I be impacted by the fact that people might not want to buy oil and gas from Alberta in 30 years? Is everyone going to be net zero within 10? Like, there's many questions that are not currently being considered in current financial plans that Larry Fink is saying, you have to start considering these because they're going to end up bankrupting you. And I'm going to end up losing money because of it. So please start doing it. You're seeing the financial implications of it right now. And I think the biggest hurdle is translating that climate risk into financial risk. So it'll be a really critical time in the next 10 years to start to do that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the time.
No worries.
It was a great conversation, and we'll talk again soon, man.
Okay, cool. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Cheers.
Bye.
I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by GlobalNL. A special thank you to my co-host Jeremy Andrews, editor Hi Nim, and producer Frank Smythe. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to sharing more stories about Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things around the world.